Lindsey, thanks very much for agreeing to speak with Heckle this morning. I wonder if you could just start by introducing yourself and your organization very briefly, please.
Yeah, sure. My name's Lindsey Collen, and I'm a member of Lalit. Lalit is an organization, a political organization that's existed since 1982 as an organization, as a political party. But in fact, it started around a publication in 1976. And it was a sort of left publication, but open to all articles. I don't think we ever refused any. We might have refused some bad poems, but never, never an article to my memory. And it was run as an activist organization. In other words, you had to be a distributor of the magazine in order to be in the assembly of distributors, which was the supreme power of the thing. All distributors were in it. And once a year it would elect the editorial board. That was revocable for not distributing. We were quite strict at the time. Anyway, what happened was we, as a publication, a simple publication, but we became very implanted in all the working class areas where all the sugar mills are. There were about 21 at the time. And it was a time when there was a build-up to a general strike over the next 3 or 4 years till 1979 in August. And then this assembly of distributors became like the leadership, or at least the part leadership of a general strike movement of all across all sectors, and it lasted about 2.5 weeks. Ended in a hunger strike with not even water. So they were all nearly dead after 3 days because you don't last long in hot weather without water. Anyway, all that to say, we ended up becoming a political movement, an independent party, because the larger left movement, the MMM, it was called, Mouvement Militant, the militant movement of Mauritius, it became much more right-wing. You know, you can imagine when everything separates out and you don't have the revolution, you end up with that leadership becoming very pro-capitalist in its actions and in its ideas. And so we became a political party. So that's Lalit. And we've been working in particular on the Diego-Chagos and Chagos issues for years. And I'm in Mauritius, although I was born in South Africa, because I'm here. Is it why I'm here? I don't know. You can never really explain this. But I met the man who would become my husband later while we were both in London. And we came here on holiday to meet his parents. Well, I'd already met his parents, but to visit his parents. And then it seemed so interesting politically that we stayed. And so that was 50 years ago. So here I'm still here today.
Well, that's very romantic, isn't it? So obviously the issue of Diego Garcia, that goes back to, I believe it was 1965, when the islands were taken away from Mauritius before Mauritius became independent. So it's obviously been a long thing. And has Lalit been campaigning around that from the very start as a magazine?
Yes, yeah, right from the very start. And we were doing all sorts of things, like I can remember 1977, distributing a leaflet when there was a visiting American warship in the docks at Port Louis, and about 6 or 7 of us in this distribution of a magazine outfit called The Class Struggle, Lalit de Classe. Lalit means the struggle. And we distributed leaflets calling on them to get their government to close the base and to leave Jago. That's from about 1977. And from even before that, the Chagossians who had been left here had organized, and a lot of Mauritian groups that were not Chagossians also worked together with them. But, you know, to get to what happened, because you said it started in 65, so could I situate it a bit internationally for people in Scotland to get an idea?
Please do.
Yeah, I think it's the time when, you know, there's a huge shift from a couple of 100 years of the sun never setting on the British Empire. And then in the middle of the last century, this would turn to a new form of imperialism that wasn't purely colonial, let alone purely settler colonial, but it was another kind of empire based on military bases, and that's the US empire. And it's easier to understand the issues of Diego-Chagos, which is part of the Chagos archipelago and which is part of Mauritius, if we imagine it in this context, that it's one of the strange things that both the UK and US sort of messed up from the beginning because they were committing crimes that they were trying to hide, and whatever they did, something was bad in what they chose to do. You know, they only had two choices, and both of them were bad, but they had to do one, to do what they wanted to do. And what they were doing, and it's from about 1960, I would put it at, you know, when there was that British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, who was a Conservative Party bloke. And it's the first time that Conservatives would say they agreed reluctantly to decolonization. And that was the winds of change speech. It was well known long ago. You know, people used to talk about the winds of change speech because it meant that the whole of the British permanent state, including all those conservatives in the civil service and everything, had agreed to, or were being forced by the Prime Minister to, you know, stop the nonsense. I see the nonsense hasn't stopped when I listened to Parliament the other day when they were discussing Diego-Chagos. We could well have been in the middle of the 19th century, not even in 1960. It was amazing. But anyway, what they wanted to do, as Britain was having been bankrupted by the Second World War, Britain really needed to withdraw from all its colonies. They used to say everything east of Aden. Aden was what they used to call Yemen, and Yemen is still fighting. At the time, Yemen was very in uprising against the British colonizers in Aden. Anyway, they were trying to withdraw everything, but in converting to the new kind of imperialism that would base itself on bases, they wanted to keep part of Mauritius. That's to say, they wanted the US insisted that Britain, and Britain agreed, I suppose, wholeheartedly, as it agrees with everything now, wholeheartedly. They agreed wholeheartedly, and what they would do was to take the whole of Chagos, about 66 islands, and set up a military base on one of them, Diego-Chagos, which is like a natural harbor. It's beautiful, like a kind of half, a horseshoe sort of shape. And the middle is like a harbor, beautiful place. And anyway, they wanted this for a military base because it was long enough, a good runway, and you could have all these warships, you know, ruining the place, and huge big bunkers under the ground in the sand. And they would set that up. But the US from the beginning, and until now, there's still this going on, they wanted control, like sovereignty of some kind, over the whole of the archipelago. That's all the other islands. And so that's the first thing that they had to do. That's their aim, and that's the source of all ills, and that's what needs to be closed down and brought under democratic control. Because when you look at it, this military base, most British people don't know it exists. Even fewer, a smaller percentage of Americans even know it exists. In Mauritius, we know it exists, and we're doing our best to get it closed down, but we urgently need help from British people and American people in the working class and in all the movements that are interested in ending colonization and while we're at imperialism. So anyway, in order to do this, they had to, and this is a crime in itself, because this base has been used for unspeakable crimes, you know, illegal wars and killing civilians in Afghanistan on their way to weddings, and in Baghdad at that awful thing under the title that the Americans gave it of shock and awe, very accurate description of a terrorist state. They gave that name themselves to bombing Baghdad. But these operations were done by B-52 bombers taking off from land that we're supposed to have in Mauritius democratic control over. So the base itself is a crime. Then the second crime is that, you know, the whole of the UN system, that's all the international law that's developed and become codified and given a lot of, I would say, you know, consideration from almost everybody in the world, except the imperial leaders. It's really built on 2 or 3 basic pillars, and one of them is decolonization. So there's a lot of encoded law about decolonization, and there are 2 principles that the UK would, you know, just flaunt. The first one is that it's unlawful, and this is how Mauritius would win sovereignty in the courts. It's unlawful to break up any country in the run-up to independence. That's during the decolonization process. Decolonization is of a whole country as it was then. This is the agreed consensus that became the international law. So that was flaunted. And then secondly, there's the issue of who decides if ever there's a questioning of this. And that also, we can come to that later. That will be another crime. Who votes in a referendum in a decolonization process? What group? We'll need to go into that later, but we'll come to it later. It's become, what shall I say, news in the world, so we can deal with it in detail later. And then thirdly, the British and Americans had this very difficult problem. There were about 1,500 to 2,000 people living there, the Chagossians, and many of them had been there for 3, 4, 5 generations. And the Mauritian state, as it was, the colonial state, would come and go and run the place, give out leases for whatever industries around coconuts and that they were there. And the magistrates would go there for court cases. For example, my brother-in-law, and is not only my brother-in-law, his daughter, that's my niece, is also in Lalit. She's a leading Lalit member. Rajni Lala, she's called. Her father, he was the last magistrate to do a tour there. So he was when he was alive, he was a witness to that. And recently, Rajni found papers that show, you know, what his instructions were and a bit of his report back. So we've got the proof of it and everything. It was in 1964. So you've got this decolonizing process that involves these 3 crimes. And we found the only way not to be opportunist and not to be, you know, sort of the opposite of that, not to be cowardly, is to always keep all 3 in mind. The only way not to sell out on this is never to give an inch on any. And we found that, you know, so many people have sold out on this strike and really made fools of themselves, people who should not have, for not keeping those 3 things together. Because history has put them together. In order to make the base for the Americans, the British, with American help, stole half a country and forcibly removed with extreme cruelty the people who lived there. You know, to show the cruelty, one of the Chagossian leaders who we worked with also, he's died now, Fernand Mandarin. He was 16 years old when he decided to come to Mauritius, as was normal, you know, as the boats are plying back and forth. He'd seen 2 things he really wanted, as only, he describes this, only a 16-year-old could want this. There was a kind of T-shirt that people had that you could buy in shops in Mauritius that in Diego-Chagos, yeah, you couldn't, or any of the other islands. In fact, his family lived on many of the islands. And secondly, he wanted 3 fishing lures, you know, those plastic ones. They've got very smart, glittery plastic ones that had just been available. Somebody coming from Mauritius had them, and he really wanted those. So he saved his money, caught a ship and came here. And then when his visit was over with relatives and that here, he went to the dockside where and there's like an agency, a private agency that used to organize for people to return, and was told that the islands are closed. So he's separated from his whole family for years at the age of 16. Anyway, he's a fantastic storyteller. We could do about 3 hours just on stories I remember that he told me. I'm a novelist, so I'm always remembering people's stories. That's my day job, as it were. Anyway, that happened to Fernand Mandarin. And lots of people, when they came to Mauritius, you know, for an appendicitis op, say the nurse who was there, she may be a Mauritian or he may be a male nurse from Mauritius, would say, no, this may be an appendix. I think you should go to hospital. They would take the boat. Then when they went to go back and join their spouse or whoever, they were also told, the islands are closed. And so the cruelty, you know, builds up. And in the end, some people sort of went on strike and just refused. First, they were moved off Diego-Chagos onto the other islands. It's a bit like in Gaza right now, you know, moved from one place to another, sort of herded from one island to another, to Salomon and then to Peros Benos, or in the opposite direction, but away from Diego-Chagos. And so eventually they were literally forced to go. And the way they did it, the British and Americans sort of supervised this, was they gassed their pets on the Diego-Chagos island, killed them in front of the people. So, you know, the extremes to which they went were awful. And when they were forced onto the last shipment, I have to say, in inverted commas, they used a cargo ship and put people in the hold of the ship to bring them. Some of them got off at Seychelles, because some islands of Seychelles were also put into the new colony that Britain would set up. So anyway, those are the 3 crimes. We've summarized it. Setting up the base, which would cause all sorts of other crimes. You know, at the moment, they're crimes about those 64 Sri Lankans who seem to have helped in the struggle by their getting out of difficulty and getting into difficulty in a small boat. It showed up the awful immigration laws as well in Britain for refugees. So these refugees are still, you know, recently a British judge wanted to go and had to go and hear a case there about their illegal detention. You know, the British and American authorities really are, you know, it's almost hilarious. They steal land and then they tell other people that they're illegally when they have a shipwreck. It's so awful.
There's a striking, the role of racism, I think, is striking in the sense that in the 60s, you see the British colonial documents where they make reference to the Chagossians as Tarzans and Man Fridays. And then you have today, when the situation of asylum seekers on the island, it's the desire to have nothing to do with the islands anymore because they don't want those people to potentially come to Britain. So there's this interesting line of racism that informs all of Britain's decision making, isn't there?
Yeah, it is. It's true. And so the colonialism of the 19th century is still, you know, alive and kicking in the racism and in the you know, supremacist ideology. Because, you know, the new bases, the military based colonialism, its motto is not so much, you know, the sun won't set on the British Empire. It's, what's it called? Full spectrum dominance. It sounds so awful. Full spectrum dominance on the whole globe. So I think it's part of that. Anyway, these crimes are being committed. They're outside all democratic control. And all along, there have been huge struggles of all imaginable kinds at all levels against this. So it's something that it's not just that people have been victimized, or either Mauritius as a state or Chagossians as people. The struggles have been constant. So that gives an idea.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. No. But the Chagossian community in Mauritius, has that been at the forefront of the campaigns around the islands, and has it, you know, has it got mass support from the rest of the population in Mauritius?
The very early demonstrations that I went to in about 1975 were organized by the Mauritian party, the MMM I referred to, its movement. And Chagossians would have participated in it, but it was mainly around closing the base. Closing the base, and the slogan was Randu Diego, return. It's got a slight double meaning in Creole. Return us to Diego. Diego is the key word for the whole archipelago as well. Return us to Diego and return Diego to us. It's got a slight pun in it. And so that was the slogan. And Mauritians and Chagossians, you know, when British people talk about Chagossians, they speak as though there's some kind of apartheid going on within Mauritius. And there is prejudice against people from outer islands, it's true. But I would guess that half of Chagossians, maybe more, are married to Mauritians, which is a high percentage of integration. It's pretty, and a lot of people were already half Mauritian and half Chagossians. When they would come from Chagos to visit Mauritius, they would stay with extended family. So it's a very mixed bag. But in Lalit, say, we've worked a lot with the Chagossian refugees group, even from before it was set up. The big struggles in the early years that we were involved in were women's struggles. It was the women at the forefront of the struggles. The Chagossian women are very strong. You know, it's like a matricentral society, and they're very strong, and they had vigils, and that's what how we first worked together with Chagossians, mainly in the areas where they lived. And the press here, the newspaper, big dailies and weeklies here, would rarely ignore it or put it on a very low burner somewhere in the newspaper. And it was as if the issue was trying to be covered up by the status quo parties and by the state in Mauritius, just as it was being covered up all over in the world. There was like a kind of smothering that we see on the TV channels. You know, if you watch BBC and CNN, you see it with regard to Gaza now. But that sort of thing happened within Mauritius as well, that it wasn't spoken about. So we had some big hunger strikes and stuff led by Chagossian women. But the women in Lalit de Classe, it was still a magazine then, worked together on this. And then what happened was the Chagossians were part of the working class here. They were in that big general strike movement. I'm putting an emphasis on the words because it's in the exact sense that Rosa Luxemburg uses it. That's a general strike that moves towards an insurrection line. So the Chagossians who worked in the municipalities or the electricity board or and the cemeteries or any place that there were organized workers, the salt pans, they were part of this huge movement, and they learned how to bring their struggles from their neighborhood into the center of the capital city. So the same place where the working class had organized that hunger strike with not even water, women from Chagos, it was 8 or 9 for that one, I think, organized and put up a tent in public in the garden, company gardens. It's the old Dutch East India company gardens or something like that. The company gardens, French East India maybe, put up a tent, a bit of tarpaulin really, and had a hunger strike. So we were, as usual, supporting this hunger strike. And then at a certain point, we said, look, it had got more than a week, and still the press didn't take it up. You couldn't get the status quo to accept that there was anything wrong or that there was anything to complain about. And then we said we're going to have to do demonstrations in the streets of Pauli and block things a bit. So we had meetings and we asked the women what slogans they would like, because most Chagossians at that time couldn't read and write. So we would do the slogans. We'd agree together what slogans to do, and we agreed to put them on newsprint, which we'd fold up and hide in our clothes in a little garden next to the garden where the hunger strike is. And we'd gradually gather. And when there were enough of us, we'd pull out the slogans and run through the streets of Port Louis, which we did. And the police had to run after us. The riot police were all around because there's a hunger strike. But riot police have to be, opposite you. I've got a lot of experience in riot police. They can't be running after people. They fall over things because they got this thing. They had an opaque thing long ago in front of them, a shield that they held. Anyway, 150 women Lalit and Chagosian women running around. It was a Wednesday in 1981, running around the streets of Port Louis with the riot police running after us. And then we disperse. Silence. So we said, we'll do it again the next day. So the police had forgotten. They thought it was a one-off. So the next day we did the same thing and we ran around. Police again running after us. It's ridiculous in the middle of town. 150 people run wild. And then on the third day, nobody took any notice, as if nothing had happened. They pretended they couldn't see the women. Then we said, okay, it's cabinet meets on Fridays. At the time cabinet meets, we'll have a sit-down demonstration and block in front of the main road, main artery, which we did. But people were not very disciplined. I'd been trained in South Africa anti-apartheid things. When we all agreed to sit down, I would find myself the only one still sitting down because everybody got up and started fighting against the police except me. So I had to get up as well. In fact, no, I think the police dragged me away. But anyway, then it hit the newspaper because there was this huge fight. The thing moved a bit from in front of the Houses of Parliament. The demonstration moved a bit down to where the hunger strike was, and it was opposite the British High Commission, as well as being in the garden, the company gardens. And so then a huge street fight started. And there were lots of Vichy water bottles because they drank water in their hunger strike. Bottles. And people going by, when they saw the police hitting women and stuff, they took the bottles and started throwing them at the police. And then people started sending plates like frisbees from smart buildings nearby from the first floor at the police. And the police ran away. And I know they ran away because they'd actually thrown me into a Jeep. And then they were so attacked that they left their Jeep and I got out again. And the reason I know there was so much glass on the ground is because I'd lost my sandals and I was left. Everybody had run away. There was the smell of gas and I was barefoot standing on glass. So anyway, that's the kind of thing. So 8 of us were arrested. I had to be rearrested because when they came to counting us at the prison, there were only 7. And then in the newspapers, they could see 8 people being arrested. They said, where's this one? So that's another whole long story. Anyway, each one is enough for a whole novel. And anyway, that then became a long court case against us. We were accused under the Public Order Act, now defunct. We had a lot of struggles against the law as well, and the law went away. Another one, almost as bad, got put in its place. But the Public Order Act, we got charged with disturbing the peace or something, but on a charge where there was a minimum, not a minimum jail sentence, you know what I mean? You have an obligatory jail sentence if you're found guilty. So 8 of us were in a hilarious court case because the police had to come and they were a bit ashamed to give evidence that they'd been beaten up or that they had beaten up women. So caught between these two taboos, it was quite hard for them to give evidence that would have had us locked up. And so we weren't locked up in the end. But, the others had all been locked up. I was only locked up for a couple of hours before going to court. But anyway, every time there was a court case, there was a huge gathering. Everybody would try and come to the court case. The police would come with dogs and everything. So this went on for about the best of a year. And then, we've worked together with the Chagos refugees group, which is a big elected group here. And they elected, Mauritius, a very strange society, very democratic society. The Chagos refugee group is the majority group in something called the Trust Fund, which was set up after that demonstration, because after that, everybody, you couldn't turn your face away from the Diego-Chagos issue after we'd made a spectacle, as it were. We really made a spectacle. And so the British agreed then to some compensation and also, and then the trust fund was set up for this initial compensation. And other people, I remember the Indian government put some money in it, the Mauritian government. And then who's in charge of that? An elected group. So because the Groupe Réfugié Chagos, the Chagos refugees group, is the majority party, it ran the trust fund. Then for a while, the man I referred to called Fernand Mandarin, who at 16 years old was left stranded on the docks of Port Louis because he wanted 3 fishing lures and a t-shirt. Anyway, his group was also elected for a number of years. So we worked with both of them as a party, and often with different ideas, because they would often be tempted, or they're mass organizations, they follow their own base, to put one thing as being more important than the other. Because, the 3 issues that have to be kept together are base closure, full decolonization, and the right of return, free circulation, and reparations for Chagossians. Those are the things that have to be kept together. So the Chagossians groups, when their base is more organized, and then when things calm down, they tend to be more interested in reparations. And then more recently, when the Chagos refugees group, all their court cases that they had gone very far in the British courts, we can go into that later as well, they then have joined forces with the Mauritian government for the ICJ case at the International Court of Justice at The Hague, the UN's highest court. And that was the case that was put in by the General Assembly of the UN on a resolution drafted and submitted by the whole of the African Union. This was something we'd been pushing for and fighting for in Lalit for years to do this. And it was a really strong political struggle, because people just said, oh, it's impossible. You can't get that case and you won't win and it won't be accepted. And, there was defeatism of the worst kind. But anyway, eventually, a government did put in this case. It's the present government, actually, and won it. But, at that, just to show that someone like the Chagos refugees group, they have sometimes been more interested only in reparations or the right to return. And then sometimes they've joined with the Mauritian government. At the very beginning, they were very much against the base. When the women were still in power in the organization, they wanted base closure. But now they say they're against wars and things, but they'd still like to get jobs on the base. That's their line. So Lalit works with them, but we know that we don't agree all the time on everything. In fact, Lalit once did a joint delegation to the World No Bases Forum that was part of the World Anti-War Forum, and the US No Bases thing, no US bases it was called, but it became No Bases. It was like in the wings of the World Social Forum at Mumbai in 2004. So we had a joint delegation. And we argued and got it put on the agenda that the anti-war movement as a whole must take up base closure as one of its main aims, not wait for wars and then walk around streets of cities, capital cities, but to close down the bases and find work, create work, enforce a job security for everybody who works on bases, and get the bases closed and get the arms industry closed down. That's the kind of demand we put through jointly. And the Olivier Bancourt case, can I go on another bit of detail?
Go, be my guest.
When it came, this is a long thing, the battle had become a bit difficult at one point, and the Fernand Mandarin other group were in power in the trust fund. And then the women of the Groupe Réfugié Chagos and Lalit people, we got together to get a new, more mobilized struggle going. And it was called the Ran Nu Diego Committee, Return Us to Diego and Diego to Us Committee. And when it got strong enough, what happened was people approached the Chagos refugee group once it was strong again and suggested this court case in the British courts. And now I have to come to the point about the mistakes that the British and Americans were forced to make. I'll come to one of the mistakes and then remind me where I am. I'm going towards the Olivier Bancourt case. Yeah, so when they had, the British and Americans, when they had to steal the islands and get rid of all the people on it, they called it depopulating it. That's even worse than ethnic cleansing. You just cleanse the whole of humanity. So they cleansed the islands, and they wanted to cleanse the islands, and they wanted to steal them and sublet them to the receiver of stolen goods, the big brother. But which one do you do first? Now, it takes a long time to get the Chagossians off the islands, as we've seen. So they had to swiftly and early, as you mentioned, in 1965, steal them. Now, this is a Labour government, and it was stolen. The islands were stolen by an order in council, a queen's power, a residual monarchy power, monarchy power, behind the back of the cabinet. You know, it's like the permanent state, the Queen, if she knew, and Harold Wilson, with the help of the Americans, stole it by this order in council. So most of the Chagossians were still living there. There were some people like Fernand Mandarin who'd come to buy his 3 lieues and 1 T-shirt and got stranded. But most Chagossians were still living in Diego-Chagos, most of them, and on the other islands. And so they became British. Because what were they then? It's Britain invented a new colony. Invented a new colony in 1965 by another order in council on the same day, more or less. And they called it British Indian Ocean Territories. And they took some Seychelles Islands and all the Chagos Islands and put them into this thing called British Indian Ocean Territories, a brand new colony in 1965, when decolonization is the norm and has been for 20 years. Anyway, they became British. And since they're British, they could get legal aid for a big court case in Britain. Why? Because they're British. So they applied for legal aid, and who offered to do this for free? Sir QC Sidney Kentridge, one of the top lawyers in Britain. Now, I was very pleased when I heard this because I know him. The world is small. When I was arrested in South Africa for disturbing the peace against apartheid in about 1967 or so, there were big student movements, and there were 21 of us arrested. And we were charged under a municipal bylaw, but the apartheid laws said that if you were found guilty of anything, even a municipal bylaw, the bylaw we broke was we were distributing literature without a permit on the station, the Johannesburg General Station property. You know, we didn't, like, what's it called, W.H. Smith or something in England, a bookseller without a permit. You know, we're competing unfairly, and we were distributing leaflets to end apartheid in education. Anyway, if we got found guilty of this, there were then 2 laws, the anti-terrorism law in apartheid South Africa and the anti-communist laws, that if in the course of opposing the apartheid state, you broke any other law, then all the penalties applying up to death penalty could apply. So we had to get top lawyers. And it was Sidney Kentridge, who was my lawyer when I was about 20 or something. And so he took this case, and at the high courts, they won it. They won the case, and they got the right to return, and there was a window of opportunity to just go there. And I will have to say another bracket. Can I?
Yeah.
Okay. At the court case, the British lawyers defending the British state for 1 hour had a tirade against Lalit and said how we were a danger, you know, like we were a danger to apartheid by not having a permit to distribute literature on the Johannesburg General Station. Now, Lalit was a danger to the whole of the US empire. For 1 hour, there was a thing against Lalit, all that Lalit had done that was a danger to the British Empire. Anyway, this this case, when Olivier Banco, he won it because they're British, you had this window of opportunity. And at that moment, we tried to contact again for a second time, Greenpeace to, just organize a boat to go there. But there wasn't anyone really quick enough to do it fast. And it's a bit of a pity because, once in about 87 or so, I think it was, maybe 89. I can't remember the exact date, but Lalit contacted Greenpeace. I had to be in Holland for some reason, for talks or something. So I was delegated by Lalit to go and see Greenpeace and see if they could get a ship to take Chagossians and us to Diego-Chagos and Chagos as an action. And the people there, luckily we met some nice radical employees because they said, oh, the board will never agree with that, but there's a ship free. If you get a ship free between two actions, it doesn't have to go to the board. And they got a ship free. And so we were planning to go. It was quite well organized. And then the ship got stranded. It got iced in the Antarctica when it was doing some fishing action. So we missed that. And, you can't do it ordinarily because the board won't agree.
Can I ask, when you say Greenpeace, was there a connection, an environmental connection that would involve them? I know that I've seen in Lalit's program for the elections, there's a reference to pollution and also specifically nuclear pollution. So was that the angle by which you tried to involve Greenpeace?
Yeah. Well, in general, they were the people working in Greenpeace at the time that we spoke to them in detail agreed in any case, almost on the principle that they've got a ship, they'll do it, because they had also done work against nuclear testing in near New Zealand by the French. They'd also been involved in an action against nuclear testing. So nuclear, that aspect of environment more. But we fell out with Greenpeace once. And this brings us a bit into more modern times, because the British state really, they decided at some point that the clever thing for them to do would be to declare this. I'm talking about in the 2000s, about 2004 or something, 4 or 5. They would declare a marine protected area in the BIOT, the British Indian Ocean Territories, otherwise known as Chagos. It's theirs, because they said it's theirs. And they're going to declare a marine protected area where there's a base with nuclear stuff in it. Never mind. And bases are just filthy from an environmental point of view. But anyway, what they did, the British state managed to get about a whole slew of NGOs involved in environment. Some of them you can expect is the Royal Conservatoire or something, that you can understand that they're part of the British state. But Greenpeace was in on it. In order to save the little fishes, they were prepared to, renege on decolonization and the base. Looking at one issue, see what happens even to Greenpeace when they look at one of those issues, they do something awful. And they would not have been found out. We denounced them. It's on our site as well. We denounced them for this and told them to rectify and get out of this trap they've fallen into. And they wrote a very patronizing letter pretending they hadn't understood what we said. And then the WikiLeaks cables were published by Julian Assange, now recently released. And this fantastic work of WikiLeaks releasing cables showed the British diplomats telling their American counterparts not to worry about this marine protected area. It's just to keep Mauritius and Chagossians out of it. So you had it in black and white. And this is where the contradictions come in when they make mistakes. They do this one thing and they had to do it, but then it causes another problem. And what happened was the British then put in their case, the Mauritian government then, once the WikiLeaks had published this, the Mauritian government got the courage, the first bit of courage to go into the UN system other than resolutions. The Mauritian governments and all political parties, their verbiage in the UN, the African Union is often, I wouldn't say perfect, but really splendid for what they are, splendid, but their actions, no. And so we'd been forcing for them to go into the UN system and, get a judgment from someone. So when they saw that the marine park was just a fig leaf for continued colonization, the then government, there was a Labour government in power then, these governments are similar, but the Labour one was in power then, and they put in the first case under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, called UNCLOS. It's got a tribunal of its own, binding tribunal. The binding tribunal said Britain's got nothing to do with the marine park or marine protected area in the Indian Ocean, because it's not a state that's next door to it. You have to be sort of touching the water somehow. And so 2 of the 5 judges, in addition, said, but on sovereignty, we have a right to decide. The other 3 said, we haven't got a right to decide this. It's the ICJ that can decide this. The other 2 said, of course, we've got the right to. Mauritius has sovereignty. It's clear. It's clear cut. Everybody knows this. So this case, once it had been won, allowed the next government to put the ICJ case in. And it's all because Britain and the US keep getting caught in forks. When they decide that they have to steal the islands first and then get rid of the people became British by definition, because what else were they? They couldn't have no country. Then they get legal aid and they get Kentridge and they win. It was later overturned, but they won the right to return, and they all were told, well, you've got to get British passports, everybody. And in this case, they're getting into another bad corner. So they say, let's use this new fashion for the environment. That's probably how they talk about it. Talk about the language they use, the racist language and the paternalistic language. Say, oh, let's declare a marine protected area. And then this is what creates the space for the ICJ case to be won, in a knockout.
And so you have these 2 successive instances, the International Tribunal of the Law in the Sea and then the International Court of Justice, both say, this is Mauritian territory, and the UK has got no right to it. And then you've got this treaty that's just been announced between the Mauritian government and the UK government that then agrees this 99-year lease. It says that the Chagossians can't return to Diego-Garcia because of the base. Why would the Mauritian government, having secured these international rulings, then go back and give the UK everything it wants out of it?
Well, before we get onto this, can I get onto some of the, can you remember that one? Because this is the main thing. Okay. The reason we're talking is this, but there are 1 or 2 other things we need to get in.
Okay.
Once the British were beginning to be in corners, and well, right from the beginning, they had to do everything behind the backs of the UN system. And they were called out every year, just about from 1965. They were called out at the UN General Assembly before they stole it. They were warned not to. So it's been constant, huh? But now so they've always been worried, and they've always had what in Lalit we've termed, that's their plan A, it's ours, keep it a secret, keep lids on it. When you ask us questions, we'll say, oh, no, we can't say anything because this is to do with the safety of the West, and the US decides that. Don't speak to us, speak to the US. When you speak to the US, anyone, their citizens or us or anybody, the US will say, oh, no, it's a bilateral issue between Mauritius and the UK. So they had this kind of, that's how to keep it down. That was plan A. Let them fight it because we are the owners. Hang on to it. Plan B is, if we find ourselves in a terrible spot, and this accelerated wildly, plan B is full on. The British state worked on this and has worked on it for 24 years in case they need plan B. Plan B is that they will have a referendum amongst Chagossians. So they'll try and get as many Chagossians as possible, especially in leadership roles in the organizations, to come and settle in Britain, get them to get Chagossian identity and Chagossian everything, and then we'll have a referendum amongst Chagossians. So that was the plan B. Huh? So they've been running on this plan B and financing it. NGOs, finance to the hilt. Academics, otherwise with great integrity, like Greenpeace, you know. I don't know how they all fall into it. All sorts of people, artists, all have got a vested interest in this sort of Chagossian industry run by the British state. And what happened was the ICJ judgment was such a knockout. It not only knocked out Plan A and said, this is and always has been Mauritian. Get out at once. That's what it says. That's the judgment. It's online. It's a lovely read. And secondly, they said, which everybody knows in decolonizing law, except people under the influence and the hegemony of the real imperialists, it's hard to know it because it's outside of the scope of things. In any decolonization situation, the whole of the people, remember I said I'd come back to this, the whole of the people are the constituency that vote of that country. That's international law, and it was laid down in the ICJ judgment. So Plan B goes overboard. It would have to be a referendum of everybody that's all Mauritians at the time, because Mauritius is what's getting independence. Now, this is not only international law, it's the elementary logic of human thinking. Because can you imagine if Britain said, oh, I'll give, I don't know, some part of South Africa its independence, but that bit where the gold mines are, I think I'll hold a referendum. Or where there's many islands, you know, you can have these ones, but I want the ones that are rich in minerals. I'll have a referendum there. And France has done that with Mayotte. It had a referendum in Mayotte, which is part of the Comores. And before having the referendum, it got lots of French people to go and live there, built a higher infrastructure than there is on the other three main Comore islands, and then held this, you know, illegal referendum. But when all eyes are on you, like they're on Britain now, this referendum's out of the question. It's against international law. It's all a load of rubbish. But the reason it makes so much noise, like in the British Parliament, is that nobody knows any better, because it's not in people's vision to know that self-determination in the decolonization process is the whole of the territory, not a hand-picked bit. And so their Plan A and Plan B both got knocked out. Now, to get to your main question about the Mauritian government, we are not surprised. The Mauritian government party, at the moment, it's got four elements going into elections now. We've got elections on the 10th of next month. So they've got four parties. The opposition, the main opposition, parliamentary opposition around Labour, has got, oh no, the government one's got 5 parties now, I made a mistake. The opposition got 4. And you can say that the totality of these two alliances are in favor of the base and, you know, protecting the West and all this sort of, I don't know what to call it, rubbish. So they've always wanted to get like the equivalent of a rent money, you know, as if Mauritius doesn't need a sort of economy or economic planning or production of any kind or whatever. It needs to get money, you know, for renting out Diego-Chagos. So that is the line, and it's really hegemonic across all the parties, I would say, except Lalit's the only one that's really in favor of closing the base down. And if you're not in favor of closing the base down and struggling for it over time, there's no way that you're going to just do anything else except try and make money for you. So we're not surprised, but we are horrified, if you know what I mean. It's awful. But I don't know if this treaty is an amazing thing. Well, not the treaty, we haven't seen it yet. The joint declaration or whatever, joint statement, I don't know what it's called, between the Prime Minister Starmer, Labour again, you know, between Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, and Keir Starmer, the mind boggles. Well, we've got the same sort of thing, you know, all the mainstream parties here, in words, are socialist, and their names often include socialist. and they're all anti-capitalist, and they're all pro-Palestinian. But in reality, to make them do anything, it takes huge mobilization, which is what we always do. How to mobilize enough to force them at some point to cede and act and to match their words, as it were. But this joint statement is so weird because Britain has now signed in this joint statement up to the fact that Mauritius is sovereign over Chagos, including Diego-Chagos. It's a quotation. But in the same paragraph, it goes on to say that, I don't know if this is possible in human language. That's why, even if I know it off by heart, I have difficulty saying it. Britain will be authorized to exercise Mauritius's sovereignty. I mean, isn't this mistaken identity or wrong pronouns or something? It sounds completely as though it doesn't make grammatical sense. Britain will be entitled, will be authorized to exercise Mauritius's sovereignty in matters concerning Diego-Chagos, not very clearly over Diego-Chagos, in matters concerning Diego-Chagos, and any matters that concern the sort of running and effectiveness of the US base. That means even in another island, because everyone in Mauritius other than Lalit is interpreting the agreement, to mean that Mauritius has sovereignty over the other islands, but not Diego-Chagos. That's also, if it were that, it's still horrifying. But in addition, there's a bit of the same sentence that ends by saying, Britain will exercise this sovereignty on any matter that threatens the running or the effective running. Effectiveness, how effective is it? And who will take this decision? I mean, you don't have to look far. The US takes all decisions. It might pretend sometimes that Netanyahu is forcing it to sell its arms, but it isn't. It may pretend that something's, the UK will have sovereignty, but in effect, just like the USA, the Pentagon kicked a British judge off British Indian Ocean territory when it was wholly sovereign. Now, when it's only exercising somebody else's sovereignty, Mauritius's sovereignty in effect, well, it'll have less say relative to the USA. So now you see, we really do need internationalism for working people and progressive people all over Britain, the US, and Mauritius, and the whole world, but at least us working together on closing down the space. It's our joint responsibility.
And you mentioned several times, the support that Lalit has for the Palestinian struggle. And of course, with the US being a direct participant in what happens in Gaza, you've been making that connection, right, about the base and how it's now, is Mauritius now going to be complicit in a genocide?
Exactly. This is the worrying thing. We would, by on our territory, allowing such a base to exist. We've already been complicit in bombing wedding parties and Baghdad and rendering, that's torture of prisoners on our territory, for allowing this, the thief of the Chagos, the British and Americans, to imprison people who shipwrecked and keep them for 3 years imprisoned. You know, and then they talk about other people taking hostages. They took 64 Sri Lankan hostages. I think people should come before the criminal court, not just Netanyahu, but a few others as well. And yeah, it is a responsibility, jointly and severally, to get this base closed down and to get democratic control there, so that the same kind of democracy that the Chagossians already have, they can have a decentralized government and, you know, a kind of federal system and, you know, run the show. But as this treaty sounds really awful, really, really, 99 years, this exercise of Mauritian sovereignty by Britain. For a start, 99 years, renewable. Last time they only took it 50, renewable for 20 years. And the British states, when Mauritius was putting in a case at the UN via the General Assembly, They tried to do it before it came up for 20 years renewal. And they got, tricked and everything by the British and American state and how they manipulate the UN system. So they had time to get another 20 years because it came up in 2016. And then Mauritius only managed to get its that UN General Assembly resolution to go to the ICJ in 2019. We've been running poster campaigns about going to the ICJ for about 30 years, and petitions and leaflets and everything. But it did eventually go, but it had already been renewed, but only 20 years. Now it's, and 99. I mean, it's like they're selling shoes on the main street, They cost 999 rupees, 99 cents. It's 100 years. 100 years. So it's a terrible treaty that they're cooking up. And so far it's secret. So we don't even know what other things and what other horrors are in it. Because sometimes in Parliament, I think Starmer lets slip some other control that they'll have. Oh, no, we will be controlling that because it would affect the base. So if on an outer island, Mauritius wants to build a port, well, Britain now exercises Mauritian sovereignty, and America says that will make our base less effective. Well, there goes your port. So, these struggles along. But, it's so fantastic that we've got this far. But to link it again to Palestine, at the moment, one of our members is in Palestine. We go to Palestine. It'll be the 5th time a member's gone, and to do volunteering at the grassroots with Palestinian organizations, just to face up to the occupying army. So we really, and we link these issues. And I don't know if you watched any of the case, the case that Nicaragua put into the ICJ. It came up for judgment this year, and Israel's occupation was found to be totally illegal. The case was only from 1967 onwards. And in fact, the judges deplored that. They said they would have liked to have been asked from before as well. But from 1967, it's been illegal, the Israeli occupation in Gaza and the West Bank. And in that case, Mauritius sent a legal team to go and support the case against Israel. And this was because the case that Mauritius put overlaps on legal points, a number of legal points, with the case that was put against Israel. The illegal occupation has a lot of overlapping legal argumentation. So yeah, we on Palestine as well, our government, we have to do a lot of, everything, demonstrations and everything to get our government to do anything, as no doubt you have the same experience. To get 3 defense contracts annulled for being against British law, you've had to have the biggest demonstrations imaginable in the whole of the UK. It's fantastic. Congratulations to all of you for organizing all the demonstrations.
Thank you. Well, I think that's probably all the time I've got this morning, but I've really enjoyed speaking to you and hearing about the issues, and I hope that we can continue to have a dialogue as the struggle goes on. As you say, it's not nearly at the end. So thanks again, Lindsey, and I hope if there's any final words that you want to share with our readers.
Just to say that these struggles, they ebb and flow, and we've just got to keep hope, because I think more and more people over the past year have understood what colonization is and what decolonization therefore is. More and more people have understood military occupation and what that means. More and more people have understood the need for peace and demilitarism, closing down bases, closing down arms factories, stopping the production of all this kind of heavy weaponry. And of course, the right to free circulation that links up again with the migrants issue, that even within Mauritius now, once the Chagos issue has been, adjudicated in favor of Mauritius, we still haven't got free movement in any of that when I see what the treaty looks as though it's going to be. So the struggle continues on all these issues. And although it sometimes looks pretty pretty tough, and it is very, very tough for people of Gaza. You know, it's almost too hard to contemplate, but we will win.